Hello and welcome to the video. This is a very quick build overview of this model here. This is the Tyro79. It's 140mm or 3-inch DIY quadcopter. Now this is a bit of a steal. It's only about £62, just over £62 at the moment when I got this one, and it's a great little build for those of you that loved watching the recent 3-inch build that I did with the Armatan frame and all of the very expensive components. You wanted to kind of follow along, but you wanted something a lot cheaper. This is absolutely for you. And I'm very pleased to see that we're starting to see kits like this come out again. It means that for those of us that get as much of a kick out of building the model as flying it, it gives us something to do on these cold, dark winter evenings. So while I unbox this, let me just go through some of the specs. So this is 140mm racing frame. It's a single piece frame, so try not to snap an arm because you have to take everything off it. 3mm thickness, and all of the other plates in here are 1mm. It has aluminium size and everything is anodized and goes together, which is very pretty. The motors in this are 1607 2800 kV motors, 2 to 4S capable. There is a 4-in-1 20 amp BL Heli ESC that's going to run D-Shot 600, capable of 20 amps sustained, burst to 25 amps, but you won't get anywhere near that with this little model. The flight controller is a bit of a wacky one. I couldn't find lots of manuals for this. It's an F4 base flight controller, and it's running the Maytech F411 target in Betaflight. It comes flashed with Betaflight with a reasonably modern version. I upgraded mine just the latest and greatest, but more about that in a sec. The camera itself is a 700 TVL line unbranded thing. I wasn't expecting a lot of performance out of this, but it's done a lot better than I thought it would. The VTX on here supports 0, 25, 100 and 200 milliwatts and is also smart audio capable. Comes with a supplied little whip. You also get the propellers in the box along with all the cables you need, cable ties, things like a battery strap, battery protection plate and all those bits as well. So with this, you're going to need a battery charger, you're going to need goggles and a radio and little receiver as well to be able to build it out. But for about £63, it's amazing that all these pieces are in the kit, and it provides a very cheap and easy way if you want to build a quadcopter that will weigh well under the 250 gram limit for you to get into that part of the hobby. So job one, before you do anything else, plug the flight controller into the computer. Make sure that everything is working okay and that Betaflight can see it, and you can move the board around and just check all the settings are right. We'll come back and configure the flight controller. I'll show you all of the different settings in a moment. The thing you have to be really careful of, and wasn't documented and caught me out, and I lost about an hour trying to figure out why it wasn't working, is there are 3 little pads on the side which you have to solder together, either one side for S-Bus or one side for PPM. That wasn't done from the factory, and that meant when I got my build together, I was struggling with S-Bus. So just solder the S-Bus connections as per this video before you go any farther. There isn't an awful lot of soldering on this. Most of the connections are done with cables, which is great if you've only done a couple of builds. And while I'm talking about that, do be aware that there are a number of quadcopter building for beginners series on the channel. If you've never built a quadcopter before, go and have a look at those. In this video, it's more to show you how to put this model together, as there isn't a manual for the build included in the kit, which is a little bit of an oversight. Next job then is the power system. Make sure that all the motors are in the right corner. So when the motors are turning in the right direction, as per that diagram in Betaflight, that it's actually tightening the prop. There's 2 clockwise, 2 counterclockwise, pop them in the corners. There's an awful lot of one particular type of screw provided in the kit that's long enough to go through the 3mm base plate, and you use that to support not only the motors and attach them, but also for the frame and anything that connects directly onto the main part of the frame itself. Once you've got those in place, then prepare the 4-in-1 ESC. Solder on the XT30 with the pigtails onto the bottom of the 4-in-1 and attach that to the base plate again using the same screws that you've just used for the motor. Once you've done that, it's just a case of routing the cables, clipping, stripping and soldering those into each of the positions. And once you've done that, along with that little S-Bus bridge that you've done on the flight controller, you can put the soldering iron away. All the rest is just plugging in cables, which makes it a very fun, easy build. So onto the cabling. So now the next job is to pop the flight controller on top of that 4-in-1. Just be aware of the arrows that are on each of the PCBs. Make sure they're pointing towards the front of the craft so that you're keeping the orientation right. And if you've got the orientation right, the cable that's there to plug in the 4-in-1 into the flight controller, the ports will be right by each other and you can just plug those in, and that's all that cabling between those two boards done. Next thing I'll plug in here is the camera. This is the only cable that's a little bit funky. There's one end of it that plugs into the camera and only uses 3 of the 4 available pins, because the spare pin is for the OSD that isn't used in this build, and the other end only has 3 pins, whereas actually it's a 4-pin connector. Make sure it's plugged in so that the spare pin is away from the power connector that we've just plugged in as per this video, and then everything will match up. The receiver cable comes connected to a servo. I'm going to use one of these little XM receivers. This is only going to be a park flyer, so that's going to work fine. You need to have a relatively small receiver. Something like an XM or an XM Plus, if you have an FR Sky radio, is a perfect size. This plugs into the back and it only goes in one way. And the last thing to plug in then is the video transmitter, the VTX, which is going to go on the top. And again, the little cable that comes with the VTX, which is slightly shorter, is a better option for the one that comes in the kit. So just plug that into the side. Once that's done, then I would go into Betaflight and go through the configuration again and make sure that everything is working. You'll probably find that 2 of the motors are moving the wrong way round when you come to plug everything in. Again, I would always just double check on the XT30 with an ohm meter that you haven't got a dead short on the power. Plug everything in, go through the standard setup. And let me show you how I've got Betaflight configured here, how all the ports are set up, and that's flying fine for me. And while this is playing, let me very quickly say, if you're not familiar with Betaflight, again, go and have a look at the Betaflight Bind and Fly setup video that takes you through each of these options. Now, having that S-Bus bridge on the flight controller should mean that all the S-Bus stuff is working and it bursts into life. The flight controller has the on-screen display on board, and it also does power the receiver from the USB connection, so you can very quickly test out that you have all the radio pieces working beautifully. Once you're happy with that, then you can go through and test the motors. Typically, 2 of mine were moving in the wrong direction, and that's pretty much expected. It's a 50-50 chance of getting it the right way round. So jump into BL Heli and reverse the 2 that weren't right. Once we've got that done, then I'm happy that everything is working and we can start to put everything together. And I'd recommend doing it this way because once you've got all the sides on, it can get a little bit tricky. Now the sides come in a couple of pieces. There are these kind of ear-shaped anodized aluminium pieces. If you look, there are 2 cutouts for the camera at the front. Mount the 1mm side plates to the outside of those pieces with the shinier, shorter bolts that should be so that the bolts actually don't protrude through the inside of the frame. Make both of those sides, and then it's a case of attaching it to the bottom of the chassis using the same bolts that you've used for the motor and the bottom of the flight stack as well. Attach the camera just one side. Don't nip up the little screw really hard. It's a little Phillips head screw with kind of an inbuilt washer. Just pop that on one side. Once you're happy with that, then you can make up the other side of the cage and pop that in the same place and just do the 2 bolts underneath. And then there's some brackets that go across, as well as an anodized piece at the back, which is there to support the VTX antenna. Once that's all done, then it's time for a quick test hover. And once you know that it's flying, then it's out to the field. So let me show you some FPV footage while I talk about my thoughts on this particular model. So here's some footage from my very first flight with this quadcopter. You've noticed it's updated to Betaflight 3.5.5, and that I did because I was having trouble getting that S-Bus stuff to work. But hopefully by doing that little bridging of the S-Bus pads I've talked about earlier in the video, everything should work fine. You'll notice that the camera is working okay, but it's absolutely nothing to write home about. I don't know whether this camera could actually do with a little bit of focusing. Things in the distance do seem a little bit grainy and out of focus, but in the low, bright sunshine that I have in this particular morning that I'm doing the flying test, it's coping pretty well. The wide dynamic range seems to be pretty good, and I'm not getting any blown out parts of the image when it's looking directly into the sunshine. Do seem to be getting a little bit of noise in the FPV feed. Interestingly, not all the time. It does seem to be when it's looking directly into the sun. I don't know whether that's overloading some part of the camera or when I'm particularly low to the ground, and that could be just due to the fact that I'm getting a really poor signal into my goggles. But overall, the flying experience is really good. This is flying with a completely different set of props. I'll show you those in a minute from the red ones that you saw in the original kit. It's hovering just under 50% throttle and is very, very nice to fly. It's just that slight fuzziness on the camera for me, which means that I'm not completely comfortable about trying to fly through some of these goalposts where I'm just having my first test flight. Overall, on that 653S battery, I'm getting about 6 minutes of flight time with these particular props. So what do I think about this model? Well, it is brilliant to see a nice kit like this for this kind of money. It's a great experience putting this together. The fact that the only soldering you need really is the power system and everything else is on cables is great for those of you that are not big fans of soldering. Goes together pretty well, and the camera works better than expected. When I saw that it was a no-name brand camera, I didn't have very high hopes indeed, but from the testing and flying I've done here, it's performed pretty well, and indoors it's nice too. If you wanted to make this a much better quad, I would probably replace that camera. That's one of the few things that I would do to it. I like the way that all the bits that you need are in the box, the cables, cable ties. The only thing you're going to need is a bit of heat shrink potentially, good soldering iron, better solder, and a couple of basic tools like screwdrivers and hex drivers. The orange aluminium pieces along with the carbon fiber, and I've replaced those props with these props here. These are actually Gemfan 3035 bullnose orange props, 3-bladed versus the 4 that it came with. I broke my blades on the very first hover in the back garden. I had incorrectly set the modes. I thought I was in angle mode and I wasn't. I was in acro, a little bit too low to the ground, and it caught one of the blades. The blades that come with the kit itself are spectacularly fragile and very aggressive, so I was struggling to get those in any decent time, so I've replaced them with these props here. They're much quieter and it is a much more docile experience flying with these other props, and maybe that's the reason that I'm getting my 6-minute flight times. Again, I'm flying on 3S with these props and it is performing beautifully. Put 4S on this, I'm sure it would be a much more aggressive machine. But on 3S, it's a lovely quadcopter for flying around and exploring the local area well under that 250 gram limit. Again, this one here with this battery that I'm using is 228 grams. Well below 250 gram limit, so for this kind of money you can get yourself a kit and put it together over 2 or 3 nights in the winter and have yourself a smashing little 3-inch quad. I'm really pleased to see that these kind of things are starting to come back into vogue, because for ages it was tricky to get decent kits that didn't cost an awful lot of money. And the last 3-inch quad that I built was probably 3 times this cost. Alright, had things like run cam split in it and those things as well, but for an awful lot of people that was just too expensive. A couple of things about this quad and build. First things is, don't forget you're going to need a radio, goggles, battery and a charger. So although the kit itself is relatively inexpensive, there's lots of extra pieces that go around it to make it into a functional model that you can fly. Some of the pieces in the kit do show their cheapness. You probably spotted a few things. The carbon fiber on the main part of my single frame weren't great. The corners aren't very well finished. I'd probably recommend running an emery board or a little bit of sandpaper over all the edges on the quadcopter just to finish the stuff off, but then you're kind of going to expect those kind of shortcuts on a kit that's costing this little money. The thing that I'm really disappointed in is that there isn't any kind of manual or setup instructions from Eachine for this particular kit. Even basic stuff, like you probably noticed in the on-screen display footage from that initial flight, that the copter itself, even when it sat on the ground without the motors turning, was reading ridiculous amounts of current. So settings for things like the current meter and the voltage bits and pieces from the 4-in-1 up to the flight controller so that you can actually monitor the status of your battery accurately should be somewhere, and not be up to the pilot to try and figure out through trial and error with the Betaflight settings. The pads on the 4-in-1 ESC are very small. They will require some half decent soldering skills. If you don't want to put the cables as neatly as I have and actually put them so they go to on the outside, that could probably simplify it slightly. But there's no big pads here that will soak up lots of heat and lots of solder, so you are going to have a decent soldering iron and a little bit of soldering skill to put this together without getting into trouble. Other big thing that you have to be careful of, there aren't any spares in the box. The reason I've had to change my props out on this is because, as you saw, it only came with 4 props. Now the props on Banggood aren't particularly expensive. If you're going to order one of these as a kit, I would absolutely recommend order yourself some additional props, because they are so fragile and hard. As soon as you hit anything, they do seem to just give up the ghost. And this slowed down the production of this particular video for me, as I had to find places that stocked these kind of props so I could pop them on and finish the video and actually get out and do the final flight. And last tip is, don't forget, because this has a little linear antenna at the back, you're going to get the best experience with linear antennas and patches on your goggles as well. I use this one from Menace RC along with that linear antenna that you get with most of the FPV kit that most people throw away. This is one of the few times where it's actually going to give you a better experience. If you keep the linear antennas on your FPV goggles, you'll get a much better reception from a little model like this. So in summary, I'm over the moon that these kind of things are starting to come into the hobby. Not only can you get your hands on a 250 gram quad for not a lot of cash at all, but it's also great for those of us who love to actually build these things and put them together with our own hands. There are a couple of compromises to get it down to this particular level, but those are things that you could replace without too much hassle. Things like the camera in particular are only okay, but the rest of the electronics and kit seem to be very nice indeed. Thanks for watching the video and watching right to the very end. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you like the video and like what I'm doing here, then hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification icon too. If you really like what I'm doing, you can go the extra mile and become one of my Patreons for access to me directly for support, and also giveaways and regular updates too. If you're looking for particular content, then check out the playlist. I organise all of my videos into playlists, so if you're looking for a particular topic, you can find everything here. If it's called Introduction To, it's designed to start very simply and build on that simple introduction to teach you all about it. If it's called For Beginners, then that is really aimed at people who are brand new to that part of the hobby. You can also search on YouTube for anything that you're interested in using the search function at the top. So iNav Painless 360 will find all of my videos and even the playlists around iNav. So thanks again for watching, and happy flying.